Grace Harrison Mitchell dropped the phone, her nursing badge clattering against the kitchen counter as she stared at her father's motionless form sprawled across the linoleum floor. The strange, pulsing lump behind Robert "Buck" Harrison's left ear had tripled in size overnight, now grotesquely visible beneath his thinning gray hair, with fresh blood trickling down his weathered neck onto the Purple Heart medal clutched in his trembling fist. This wasn't the harmless cyst Dr. Thornton had dismissed for 6 months. Tyler burst through the front door, his football cleats echoing like gunshots as he skidded to his knees beside his grandfather's convulsing body, the 17-year-old's face draining of color as Buck's eyes rolled back, revealing only white. Grace's hands shook as she checked for a pulse, her 20 years of ICU experience warring with the terror of watching her war hero father dying on Christmas Eve. 911, please, my father's a veteran and something's very wrong. What had those doctors missed, and how long did Buck have left? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 months earlier, when the Colorado mountain air still carried the promise of summer and the aspens hadn't yet begun their golden dance, Robert "Buck" Harrison stood in his kitchen shaving with the same methodical precision he'd learned in the Army 50 years ago. At 67, he maintained the bearing of a soldier, shoulders square, jaw set with quiet determination, eyes that had seen too much but still held the spark of a man who'd served his country with honor. The small ranch house in Pinewood Springs felt too quiet without Martha's morning humming. 3 years now since cancer had taken his wife of 42 years. The Purple Heart in his bedroom dresser drawer told only part of Buck's story. Vietnam had left its marks, a slight limp from shrapnel in his right leg, hearing loss that made him turn up the television too loud, and nightmares that still visited on humid summer nights when the air felt thick like the Mekong Delta. But Buck Harrison was a survivor. A man who'd built a life in this mountain town where neighbors still waved from their porches, and the VFW Hall served as the beating heart of the veteran community. His daughter Grace had inherited his stubborn streak along with his steel blue eyes. At 45, she carried herself with the confident stride of someone who'd spent 20 years navigating hospital corridors, making split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death. Working double shifts in the ICU at Mercy General Hospital, Grace had become the family's anchor after her divorce from Jake Mitchell 3 years prior. The settlement had been fair, but raising a teenage son on a nurse's salary while managing her own student loan debt created a constant juggling act that left little room for error. Tyler Mitchell, Grace's 16-year-old son, possessed the easy athleticism of youth and an old soul that seemed wise beyond his years. The quarterback of Pinewood High's football team, he spent most afternoons after practice at his grandfather's house, listening to war stories while helping with yard work and minor repairs. Buck had become Tyler's male role model, teaching him to change oil, throw a proper spiral, and understand that respect was earned through actions, not words. The Harrison family had weathered Martha's illness together, taking turns at her bedside, sharing memories and learning how quickly life could change. Buck's grief had been quiet but profound. He'd lost his compass, his best friend, the woman who'd waited for him through 13 months in Southeast Asia and stood by him through decades of building their life together. Now, as summer gave way to the brutal Colorado winter that would test them all, none of them could have imagined that Buck carried a secret inside his skull, a fragment of his war that had traveled home with him, silent and hidden, waiting like a ticking bomb. Dr. William Thornton, the family practice physician who'd served Pinewood Springs for over 20 years, had built his reputation on old-fashioned bedside manner and practical medicine. But reputation, as the Harrison family would soon learn, didn't always translate to competent care, especially when it came to understanding the invisible wounds that veterans carry long after the shooting stops. The first sign came during Buck's morning shave on a humid Tuesday in late June, when his weathered fingers discovered a small, hard lump nestled behind his left ear. He paused, razor halfway to his jaw, and pressed gently against the unfamiliar bump. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered to his reflection, the same phrase he'd used when stepping off the transport plane at Travis Air Force Base in 1972. At 67, Buck had learned to expect his body's small rebellions, creaking joints, reading glasses, the occasional memory lapse that made him search for words that used to come easily. He dismissed the lump as part of getting old, another badge of a life fully lived. But over the following weeks, as July's heat settled over Pinewood Springs like a heavy blanket, the bump grew more pronounced. Buck found himself touching it absent-mindedly while watching the evening news or sitting on his front porch, where Martha's empty rocking chair served as a constant reminder of conversations they'd never have again. The headaches began during the 4th of July weekend, starting as a dull throb that Buck attributed to the VFW's annual barbecue preparations. He'd spent the morning setting up folding tables and stringing red, white, and blue bunting across the community center, the same tasks he'd performed for 15 years. But by afternoon, when the first families arrived with their potato salad and patriotic enthusiasm, Buck found himself wincing at the sound of children's laughter and the crack of firecrackers that usually filled him with nostalgic pride. "You okay, Grandpa Buck?" Tyler asked during the barbecue, using the nickname that had stuck since childhood. The teenager had noticed his grandfather's unusual quiet, the way Buck rubbed his temple when he thought no one was looking. Buck forced a smile and ruffled Tyler's hair, the same gesture he'd used to comfort his daughter when she was young and worried about her father's nightmares. "Just tired, son. Too much excitement for this old soldier." But privately, Buck admitted something felt different. The headaches carried a sharp, insistent quality that reminded him of the ringing in his ears after mortar attacks, a sensation he hadn't experienced in decades. Grace noticed the change during their weekly Sunday dinner at Buck's house, a tradition that had become more important since Martha's death. Her trained eye caught the subtle signs, the way Buck held his coffee mug with both hands to prevent trembling, his tendency to turn his head when she spoke, the slight grimace that crossed his face when Tyler's voice rose with excitement about football season. "Dad, you've been rubbing your head all evening," Grace said as she cleared the dinner plates, her voice carrying the gentle authority of someone accustomed to caring for others. "Maybe you should have Dr. Thornton take a look." Buck's jaw tightened with familiar stubbornness. "I didn't survive Nam to be taken down by a bump on my head, Gracie. Some aspirin and a good night's sleep will fix whatever this is." But even as he spoke, Buck felt the lump pulse with a rhythm that seemed to match his heartbeat, as if something inside was trying to break free. The following Monday, Grace's persistence finally wore down Buck's resistance. She drove him to Pinewood Medical Center, a small clinic that served the mountain community with basic health care needs. Dr. William Thornton had treated the Harrison family for over a decade, delivering Tyler, caring for Martha during her final illness, and providing Buck with routine checkups that had always been reassuringly normal. Dr. Thornton's examination was cursory at best. The middle-aged physician barely glanced at Buck's medical history before pressing his fingers briefly against the lump, which had grown to the size of a walnut. "Mr. Harrison, at your age, these things happen. Could be a cyst, maybe a swollen lymph node. Nothing to worry about." Buck felt a flutter of relief, but Grace frowned from her chair in the corner. "Doctor, he's been having severe headaches, and the lump has grown significantly in just a few weeks. Shouldn't we do some tests?" Thornton's smile was patronizing as he reached for his prescription pad. "Mrs. Mitchell, I understand your concern, but sometimes we overthink these minor issues. I'm prescribing some pain medication for the headaches. If the lump doesn't shrink in a few weeks, we'll reassess." As they left the clinic, Buck felt vindicated in his initial instinct to avoid medical attention. "See, Gracie, Just an old man's body acting up. But Grace's nursing instincts whispered that something was wrong. 20 years in intensive care had taught her to recognize when symptoms didn't align with simple explanations. That night, as Buck lay in the bed he'd shared with Martha for over 4 decades, the headache intensified to a level that made sleep impossible. He pressed his fingers against the lump, feeling it pulse against his touch like a second heart beating just beneath his skin. For the first time since discovering it, Buck felt a cold thread of fear weave through his stubborn optimism. August arrived with an oppressive heat that seemed to press down on Pinewood Springs like a suffocating blanket, and with it came the undeniable truth that Buck Harrison's condition was deteriorating. The lump behind his ear had doubled in size, now clearly visible even through his thinning gray hair, creating an asymmetrical bulge that made him self-conscious about appearing in public. More troubling were the headaches that had evolved from occasional discomfort to constant, debilitating pain that left him nauseated and disoriented. Grace found her father passed out in his vegetable garden on a sweltering Tuesday afternoon, his body crumpled between the tomato plants that Martha had lovingly tended for decades. The sight of Buck's unconscious form sprawled in the dirt, his face pale and slick with sweat, sent ice through Grace's veins. She knelt beside him, her medical training taking over as she checked his pulse and breathing, all while her heart hammered against her ribs with the terror of potentially losing the last parent she had left. "Dad, can you hear me?" she whispered, gently shaking his shoulders. Buck's eyes fluttered open, confusion clouding his usually sharp gaze as he struggled to focus on his daughter's worried face. "Gracie, what happened to the garden? Did I fall asleep?" His voice carried a disoriented quality that Grace had never heard before, as if he was waking from a dream he couldn't quite remember. The fact that her father, a man who prided himself on never showing weakness, had collapsed in broad daylight while doing routine yard work, filled Grace with a dread that settled in her stomach like a stone. The second visit to Dr. Thornton's office was an exercise in frustration that left both Grace and Buck feeling dismissed and unheard. Thornton barely examined the visibly enlarged lump, spending more time typing notes into his computer than actually looking at his patient. When Grace described finding her father unconscious, the doctor's response was maddeningly casual. "Mr. Harrison, you're dealing with grief, stress, and the normal aging process. These episodes you're describing sound like anxiety attacks, which are common in men your age, especially after losing a spouse." Thornton's tone carried the condescending patience of someone explaining something obvious to a child. "I'm going to prescribe a stronger pain medication and recommend you consider speaking with our grief counselor." Grace felt her professional composure crack. "Doctor, with all due respect, I've been a nurse for 20 years. This isn't grief or anxiety. The lump has doubled in size. He's having severe neurological symptoms. And you're treating this like it's a minor inconvenience." Thornton's smile tightened. "Mrs. Mitchell, I understand you're concerned about your father, but sometimes medical families tend to overcomplicate straightforward situations. Mr. Harrison is experiencing normal age-related changes complicated by emotional stress. The medication I'm prescribing will help manage his symptoms." Buck sat silently through the exchange, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the arms of the examination chair. The headaches had become so constant that he'd begun to think of them as background noise, a persistent throb that colored every moment of his day. But it was the memory lapses that frightened him most. Moments when he'd find himself standing in his kitchen with no recollection of why he'd come there, or conversations with Tyler that seemed to slip away like water through his fingers. The third visit in September brought no better results. Thornton suggested that Buck's symptoms were manifestations of untreated war trauma, a delayed stress response that was finally surfacing decades after his return from Vietnam. "These delayed onset reactions are more common than you might think, Mr. Harrison. Sometimes the mind protects us from difficult memories until we're older and our defenses weaken. Grace demanded a referral to a neurologist, but Thornton dismissed the request as unnecessary and expensive. Our insurance protocols require that we exhaust conservative treatment options before pursuing costly specialist consultations. Let's give the current medication regimen another month to take effect. Walking out of the clinic for the third time with nothing but stronger painkillers, Grace felt her frustration boil over into anger. This is medical negligence, Dad. Any competent physician would have ordered imaging studies by now, at minimum an MRI or CT scan to rule out serious causes. Buck's response revealed how much the situation was wearing on his legendary stoicism. Maybe he's right, Gracie. Maybe I'm just an old soldier whose mind is finally catching up with all the things I've tried to forget. Lord knows I've seen enough doctors in my life to last several lifetimes. But Grace's nursing instincts screamed that something was fundamentally wrong. That evening, she began her own investigation, spending hours online researching Buck's symptoms and cross-referencing them with his military medical history. What she discovered made her blood run cold. The combination of progressive headaches, a growing mass behind the ear, and neurological changes could indicate several serious conditions, including brain tumors, infections, or complications from old injuries. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. During Tyler's homecoming football game in early October, Grace struck up a conversation with Janet Coleman, another nurse whose husband was also a Vietnam veteran. As they discussed their father's health issues, Janet mentioned something that made Grace's pulse quicken. "You know, my Charlie has been having similar problems. Headaches, confusion, a strange bump behind his ear. Dr. Thornton keeps telling us it's normal aging, but Charlie served in the same unit as your dad. They were both at Firebase Alpha when that mortar attack hit in '71. Grace felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. "Janet, has Charlie ever had his military medical records reviewed by a specialist, someone who understands combat injuries?" Thornton said it wasn't necessary. He served as an Army medic himself back in the day, so he claims to understand veteran health issues better than most doctors. Janet's voice carried a note of doubt. "But Charlie's getting worse, not better. Last week I found him in our backyard at 3 in the morning thinking he was back on patrol in Vietnam." That night, Grace made a decision that would change everything. She called the Denver Veterans Affairs Medical Center and spoke with the neurology department, explaining her father's symptoms and military history. The intake nurse's response was immediate and alarming. "Ma'am, based on what you're describing, your father needs to be seen immediately. These symptoms could indicate several serious conditions that require urgent evaluation. We can see him tomorrow morning if you can get him here." When Grace shared this conversation with Buck, she expected resistance. Instead, she saw something in her father's eyes that broke her heart, relief mixed with fear. "You know, Gracie, I've been trying to be strong for you and Tyler, but I'm scared. These headaches feel like something's eating me alive from the inside, and I can't remember half of what Tyler tells me about school anymore." The drive to Denver through the early October snow felt like a race against time, with Buck slumped in the passenger seat, the lump behind his ear now grotesquely prominent and causing visible asymmetry in his face. Grace gripped the steering wheel tighter, knowing that they were finally taking a step toward answers, even if those answers might be more frightening than the uncertainty they'd been living with. The Denver Veterans Affairs Medical Center stood like a beacon of hope against the gray October sky as Grace helped her father navigate the automatic doors into the bustling lobby. Buck moved slowly, one hand pressed against the grotesque lump behind his ear, the other gripping Grace's arm for support. The contrast between this facility and Dr. Thornton's small-town clinic was immediately apparent. Here, wheelchairs moved efficiently through wide corridors, and the staff wore the focused expressions of people accustomed to dealing with serious medical conditions. Dr. Sarah Chen, the neurologist who greeted them in the consultation room, possessed the kind of gentle authority that comes from years of delivering difficult news to families. Her examination of Buck was thorough and methodical, taking nearly an hour compared to Thornton's cursory 5-minute assessments. She spent considerable time reviewing Buck's military medical records, which Grace had requested from the National Personnel Records Center weeks earlier. "Mr. Harrison, I'm very concerned about what I'm seeing here," Dr. Chen said, her voice carrying professional gravity tempered with compassion. "The mass behind your ear has characteristics that require immediate imaging. I'm ordering an emergency MRI and CT scan today, not next week or next month." The relief in Buck's eyes was palpable. For the first time in months, a medical professional was taking his symptoms seriously, treating him like a human being rather than a hypochondriac or a malingerer. "Doctor, I've been trying to tell folks that something ain't right, but they keep saying it's just getting old or grief or some such nonsense." Grace felt vindicated, but also angry. Angry at the months of suffering that could have been prevented, angry at the dismissive treatment her father had received, and angry at herself for not pushing harder, sooner. "Dr. Chen, we've been seeing Dr. Thornton in Pinewood Springs for months. He kept insisting this was normal aging or anxiety related to my father's war service." Dr. Chen's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "I'm familiar with Dr. Thornton's work. He was an Army medic, and sometimes former military medical personnel can have interesting perspectives on veteran care." Her diplomatic phrasing couldn't quite mask the disapproval in her voice. "However, any physician should recognize that a rapidly growing mass with accompanying neurological symptoms requires immediate investigation. The MRI results, available within hours due to the emergency nature of Buck's condition, revealed something that made Dr. Chen's professional composure crack slightly. She called Grace into a private consultation room while Buck rested in the recovery area, still groggy from the mild sedation used during the scan. "Mrs. Mitchell, I need to show you something." Dr. Chen pulled up Buck's brain scans on her computer monitor, pointing to a bright white object nestled near his brainstem. "This isn't a tumor or a cyst. It's a metallic foreign object, approximately 2 centimeters in length, that appears to be shrapnel from an explosive device." Grace stared at the screen, her medical training helping her understand the implications even as her heart sank. "You're saying my father has been carrying shrapnel in his head for over 50 years? "That's exactly what I'm saying. The fragment has been dormant for decades, but recently it's begun to shift, causing pressure on surrounding brain tissue and triggering the symptoms he's been experiencing. The mass behind his ear isn't a growth. It's inflammation and swelling caused by the body's response to this foreign object." The revelation hit Grace like a physical blow. Her father had been living with a piece of the Vietnam War literally embedded in his brain, and the local medical establishment had dismissed his symptoms as psychological weakness or normal aging. "Dr. Chen, this would have been visible on any basic CT scan or MRI. How could Dr. Thornton have missed this?" Dr. Chen's silence spoke volumes before she finally responded. "Mrs. Mitchell, I can't comment on another physician's diagnostic decisions. What I can tell you is that your father needs immediate neurosurgical intervention. The shrapnel's current position is precarious. It's pressing against critical brain structures that control memory, motor function, and potentially life-sustaining processes." That evening, Grace found herself in the familiar position of making life or death medical decisions for a family member, but this time the stakes felt impossibly high. The neurosurgeon, Dr. Samuel Rodriguez, was a soft-spoken man in his late 50s whose calm demeanor couldn't quite mask the gravity of Buck's situation. "The surgery carries significant risks," Dr. Rodriguez explained during their consultation. The shrapnel is located in an area where even minor damage could result in permanent disability or death. However, leaving it in place is no longer an option. The pressure it's creating will eventually prove fatal. Buck, more lucid than he'd been in weeks thanks to medication that reduced the brain swelling, listened to the surgical explanation with the stoic acceptance of a man who'd faced death before. "Doctor, I've been living on borrowed time since 1971. If you think you can get this thing out of my head, I trust you to try." The conversation took an unexpected turn when Dr. Rodriguez began reviewing Buck's military medical records more thoroughly. His expression grew increasingly puzzled as he cross-referenced the dates and locations of Buck's service with the type of shrapnel visible on the scans. "Mr. Harrison, I need to ask you about your time at Firebase Alpha. Do you remember the specific incident that caused your head injury?" Dr. Rodriguez's questions carried an intensity that seemed to go beyond routine medical history. Buck's brow furrowed as he tried to access memories that had grown increasingly hazy. "There were so many attacks, Doctor. Mortars, rockets, small arms fire. I remember getting knocked unconscious during one particularly bad bombardment, woke up in the field hospital with a bandaged head and ringing ears. The medic said I had a concussion but nothing serious." "Do you remember the medic's name or anything specific about that treatment?" Dr. Rodriguez pressed, his voice carrying an odd, emotional undertone that Grace couldn't quite identify. "Can't say I do, Doctor. Those field hospitals were chaotic places, and I was pretty scrambled from the blast. Why do you ask?" Dr. Rodriguez studied Buck's face intently before responding. "The type of shrapnel in your brain is consistent with a specific type of North Vietnamese rocket-propelled grenade that was commonly used in 1971. The fact that it was missed during your initial treatment suggests either inadequate medical resources or extremely chaotic battlefield conditions." Grace watched this exchange with growing unease, sensing undercurrents she didn't understand. Her father's military service had always been a topic he discussed reluctantly, sharing only sanitized stories suitable for family gatherings. The reality of what he'd experienced, the violence, the fear, the life-and-death decisions, remained largely hidden behind his stoic exterior. That night, as Buck slept in his hospital bed surrounded by monitors and IV lines, Grace conducted her own investigation into her father's military service. Using the internet resources available in the hospital's family lounge, she began researching Firebase Alpha and the specific battles that had occurred there in 1971. What she discovered painted a picture of horror that her father had never shared. Firebase Alpha had been the site of multiple major attacks, including a devastating assault in March 1971 that had resulted in dozens of casualties. The base had been overrun temporarily, with hand-to-hand combat occurring within the perimeter. Many wounded soldiers had been evacuated under fire, with field medical treatment conducted under nearly impossible conditions. Grace found herself reading casualty reports and after-action summaries that mentioned her father by name. Sergeant Robert Harrison had been credited with saving the lives of several wounded soldiers during the attack, dragging them to safety while under heavy fire. He'd been recommended for the Bronze Star, though Grace couldn't find any record of him actually receiving the award. More disturbing was her discovery that the attack on Firebase Alpha had been partially enabled by intelligence failures and communication breakdowns. Several after-action reports hinted at friendly fire incidents during the chaos of the battle, though specific details remained classified decades later. The pieces of her father's hidden trauma were slowly coming together, painting a picture of a young soldier who'd endured unimaginable experiences and then spent 50 years carrying both the physical and emotional scars in silence. The shrapnel in his brain wasn't just a medical problem. It was a tangible reminder of a war that had never truly ended for the men who'd fought it. As Grace sat in the darkened hospital room watching her father's chest rise and fall with mechanical regularity, she realized that tomorrow's surgery would be about more than removing a piece of metal. It would be about finally allowing Buck Harrison to heal from wounds that had been festering for half a century, and about confronting the systematic failures that had left him suffering in silence for far too long. The weight of these revelations, combined with the uncertainty of the upcoming surgery, left Grace feeling overwhelmed by the complexity of her father's hidden pain and the long road to justice that lay ahead. The morning of December 15th arrived with the kind of crystalline cold that makes Colorado winters legendary, but inside the Denver VA Medical Center, the atmosphere crackled with a different kind of intensity. Buck Harrison lay in pre-surgical preparation, his weathered hands folded across his chest, while Grace held vigil beside his bed. The lump behind his ear had grown so large that it distorted the shape of his head, creating an asymmetrical profile that made him look like a man carrying the visible weight of decades. Tyler had driven through a blizzard, warning to be present for his grandfather's surgery, his teenage face etched with a maturity that spoke to the family crisis that had consumed their lives. The 3 generations of Harrisons sat in contemplative silence, each lost in their own fears and hopes for what the day might bring. Dr. Rodriguez entered the room with the measured calm of a surgeon who'd performed thousands of operations, but Grace's trained eye caught the slight tension around his eyes that suggested this case was anything but routine. "Mr. Harrison, we're going to take excellent care of you today. The surgical team is fully briefed, and we're optimistic about removing the shrapnel successfully." Buck squeezed Grace's hand with surprising strength. "Doctor, I've been carrying this piece of Vietnam around for 50 years. It's time to let it go." His voice carried the quiet resolution of a man who'd made peace with whatever outcome awaited him. As they wheeled Buck toward the operating room, Grace felt the familiar helplessness that comes with watching a loved one disappear behind doors she couldn't follow through. Tyler slumped in the waiting room chair beside her, his athletic frame seeming suddenly fragile in the institutional lighting. "Mom, what if something goes wrong? What if Grandpa doesn't make it through?" Tyler's voice cracked with the emotion he'd been holding back for weeks. Grace wrapped her arm around her son's shoulders, drawing on reserves of strength she wasn't sure she possessed. "Your grandfather is the toughest man I know, Tyler. He survived Vietnam. He built a life with your grandmother, and he raised me to be strong enough to get through whatever comes next. We have to trust that same strength will carry him through this." The surgery was scheduled to take 4 to 6 hours, but at the 3-hour mark, Grace noticed increased activity around the surgical wing that made her stomach clench with anxiety. Nurses moved with purposeful urgency, and she caught glimpses of additional medical equipment being rushed toward the operating rooms. Dr. Rodriguez emerged from the surgical suite at the 4.5-hour mark, his scrubs showing the telltale signs of a complex procedure. Grace rose from her chair, reading his expression with the expertise of someone who'd delivered difficult news to countless families. "Mrs. Mitchell, the surgery was successful in removing the shrapnel, but we encountered some complications." Dr. Rodriguez gestured for Grace and Tyler to sit as he pulled up a chair across from them. The metal fragment had been in position for so long that removing it caused some swelling and bleeding in the surrounding brain tissue. "Your father is stable, but he's in critical condition." Grace felt the ground shift beneath her feet. "What does that mean, exactly? What kind of complications are we looking at?" "We won't know the full extent of any neurological impact for several days. The brain needs time to recover from the trauma of surgery, and swelling can affect cognitive function, memory, and motor skills in unpredictable ways." Dr. Rodriguez's clinical explanation couldn't soften the harsh reality of uncertainty that now defined their situation. "The next 48 hours are critical." Tyler's composure finally cracked, tears streaming down his face as the weight of potentially losing his grandfather hit him fully. "This is my fault. I should have made him go to the doctor sooner. I should have done something." Grace pulled her son closer, her own eyes filling with tears she'd been holding back for months. "Tyler, this is not your fault. This is the result of a medical system that failed your grandfather for 50 years. You've been nothing but a source of joy and pride for him." The vigil that followed stretched through the longest night of Grace's life. Buck lay motionless in the intensive care unit, connected to monitors that tracked every heartbeat and breath with electronic precision. The steady beeping of machines created a rhythm that became the soundtrack to Grace's prayers, her fears, and her memories of the man who'd taught her that strength came not from avoiding difficulty, but from facing it with grace and determination. Dr. Rodriguez checked on Buck every few hours, his updates carefully neutral, but encouraging. "His vital signs are stable, and the swelling appears to be responding to medication. These are positive indicators, but we need to be patient." As dawn broke over the Rocky Mountains, casting long shadows through the hospital windows, Grace found herself thinking about the chain of events that had brought them to this moment. Dr. Thornton's dismissive treatment, the months of unnecessary suffering, the systematic neglect that had nearly cost her father his life. All of it could have been prevented with basic, competent medical care. The revelation came during her second cup of hospital coffee, when she overheard a conversation between two nurses discussing Buck's case. One of them mentioned that Dr. Rodriguez had seemed unusually emotional during the surgery briefing, talking about Firebase Alpha with a personal knowledge that went beyond medical textbooks. Grace approached the nurse's station with the directness that had served her well throughout her career. "Excuse me, but I couldn't help overhearing your conversation about my father's surgeon. Did Dr. Rodriguez serve in Vietnam?" The older nurse, a woman whose badge identified her as Margaret Sullivan, glanced around before lowering her voice. "Honey, Dr. Rodriguez doesn't usually talk about his military service, but your father's case has affected him differently than most. I've worked with him for 15 years, and I've never seen him this personally invested in a patient's outcome." The pieces of a larger puzzle began clicking into place in Grace's mind. Dr. Rodriguez's intense questioning about Firebase Alpha, his detailed knowledge of the specific type of shrapnel, his emotional investment in Buck's case, all of it suggested a connection that went deeper than professional interest. When Dr. Rodriguez made his evening rounds, Grace was waiting with questions that had been building throughout the day. "Doctor, I need to ask you something directly. Did you serve at Firebase Alpha in 1971? Dr. Rodriguez stopped in his tracks, his composed professional demeanor cracking slightly. He looked at Buck's unconscious form, then back at Grace, before settling into the visitor's chair with the weariness of someone carrying his own heavy memories. "Mrs. Mitchell, I was a 19-year-old medic at Firebase Alpha when your father was injured. I was the one who treated his head wound in the field hospital." His voice carried the weight of decades-old emotions that had been stirred by Buck's case. "I remember Sergeant Harrison very clearly because he refused pain medication so that wounded soldiers who were worse off could have it instead." Grace felt her breath catch in her throat. "You're saying you treated my father 50 years ago, and now you're operating on him again?" "The irony hasn't been lost on me," Dr. Rodriguez admitted. "What's been eating at me since I reviewed his records is that I missed the shrapnel during his initial treatment. The battlefield conditions were chaotic. We were overwhelmed with casualties, and I was working with limited equipment and experience. I've spent my entire career as a neurosurgeon partly because I knew I'd made mistakes that day that affected good men like your father." The revelation reframed everything Grace thought she understood about her father's situation. This wasn't just a case of medical negligence by Dr. Thornton, it was the culmination of a 50-year journey that had brought together a young medic who'd become a skilled surgeon and the soldier whose life he'd helped save decades earlier. "Doctor, you saved my father's life in Vietnam. Whatever happened then, you gave him 50 years with my mother, the chance to raise me, and the opportunity to know his grandson. That's not a failure. That's a gift." Dr. Rodriguez's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Your father saved my life that day too, Mrs. Mitchell. When the base was overrun, Sergeant Harrison dragged me and 5 other wounded soldiers to safety under heavy fire. I've never forgotten that debt, and now I have the chance to finally repay it." As Christmas Eve approached and Buck's condition slowly stabilized, Grace realized that their family's ordeal was about more than medical malpractice or surgical complications. It was about the invisible threads that connect lives across decades, about the price of service that extends far beyond the battlefield, and about the possibility of healing wounds that had been carried in silence for far too long. December 22nd arrived with the kind of blizzard that transforms the Colorado landscape into a desolate white wasteland, and with it came the darkest moment in the Harrison family's long ordeal. Buck had been stable for nearly a week following his surgery, showing small signs of improvement that had given Grace and Tyler cautious hope. But at 3:47 a.m., the monitors in his ICU room began screaming with alarms that sent nurses running and turned Grace's world upside down. "He's crashing," Dr. Rodriguez announced as he burst through the doors, still pulling on his surgical scrubs. Buck's body convulsed on the hospital bed, his vital signs fluctuating wildly as his brain struggled to cope with post-surgical complications that no one had anticipated. "Get him to OR3 immediately." 3. "We're dealing with massive cerebral swelling." Grace stood frozen in the hallway as medical personnel swarmed around her father's bed, their urgent voices creating a chaos of medical terminology that her nursing background helped her understand all too well. Increased intracranial pressure, potential hemorrhage, emergency craniotomy. Each phrase hit her like a physical blow, confirming her worst fears about the risks Dr. Rodriguez had warned them about. Tyler arrived at the hospital within an hour, having driven through whiteout conditions that should have made travel impossible. His face was pale with exhaustion and terror as he found his mother in the surgical waiting room, her scrubs rumpled from the sleepless vigil she'd been maintaining. "Mom, what's happening? The nurse on the phone said Grandpa was having complications." Grace's voice cracked as she pulled her son into an embrace that felt like an anchor in the storm of uncertainty surrounding them. "The surgery site is bleeding, and there's swelling in his brain that's putting pressure on critical areas. Dr. Rodriguez is operating again, but—" She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't voice the possibility that this might be the end of Buck's long journey. The second surgery stretched through the morning hours as the blizzard raged outside, creating a sense of isolation that made the hospital feel like the only place in the world. Grace found herself making bargains with God, promising anything in exchange for her father's life, while Tyler sat beside her in stunned silence, clutching his grandfather's Purple Heart medal that he'd brought from home. Dr. Rodriguez emerged from the operating room at noon, his face etched with the exhaustion of a man who'd spent hours fighting for a patient's life. Grace read his expression before he spoke, seeing the mixture of cautious relief and continued concern that meant Buck was alive, but far from safe. "The bleeding has been controlled, and we've relieved the pressure on his brain," Dr. Rodriguez reported, settling heavily into a chair across from Grace and Tyler. "But the complications have caused additional trauma to areas that control memory, speech, and motor function. Even if he survives, we're looking at potentially significant neurological deficits." The words hung in the air like a death sentence of a different kind. Grace had spent her career working with stroke patients and traumatic brain injury survivors, and she understood the devastating impact that neurological damage could have on quality of life. The possibility that her father might survive only to live as a shadow of his former self felt almost worse than losing him entirely. "What are his chances of meaningful recovery?" Grace asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Rodriguez's honesty was both brutal and compassionate. "At his age, with the extent of trauma we're dealing with, I'd estimate less than 40% chance of regaining significant cognitive function. The next 72 hours will be critical in determining what kind of recovery might be possible." Tyler's composure shattered completely at those words. The 17-year-old who'd been trying to be strong for his family finally broke down, sobbing with the raw grief of someone facing the loss of their hero. "He can't die like this. He can't die in a hospital bed hooked up to machines. Grandpa Buck survived Vietnam. He deserves better than this." Grace held her son while fighting her own despair, thinking about the man who'd raised her to be strong in the face of adversity. Buck Harrison had taught her that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the determination to keep fighting even when the odds seemed impossible. Now she needed to find that same courage as she watched him fight the most important battle of his life. The vigil that followed was unlike anything Grace had experienced, even during her mother's final illness. Buck lay unconscious, his body kept alive by machines while his brain struggled to heal from trauma that had accumulated over 50 years. The monitors showed brain activity, but it was erratic and difficult to interpret, leaving the medical team uncertain about what kind of consciousness might emerge if he survived. Grace found herself thinking about all the conversations she'd never had with her father, all the questions about his military service that she'd been too afraid to ask. Buck had carried his war experiences in silence, protecting his family from the darkness he'd witnessed. But now that silence felt like a wall between them that might never be breached. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dr. Margaret Chen, the neurologist who'd first diagnosed Buck's condition, arrived on December 23rd with test results that changed everything. She'd been conducting her own investigation into Dr. Thornton's treatment patterns, and what she'd discovered painted a picture of systematic negligence that went far beyond Buck's case. "Grace, I need to show you something that might help explain why your father's case was handled so poorly," Dr. Chen said, spreading a collection of medical files across the waiting room table. "I've been reviewing Dr. Thornton's treatment of veteran patients over the past 5 years, and there's a clear pattern of dismissing symptoms and avoiding expensive diagnostic procedures." The files told a devastating story. Charlie Coleman, the Vietnam veteran whose wife had spoken with Grace at Tyler's football game, had died 3 weeks earlier from an undiagnosed brain tumor that Dr. Thornton had dismissed as normal aging. 2 other local veterans had suffered permanent disabilities from conditions that should have been easily treatable if properly diagnosed. "This isn't just malpractice," Grace realized, her grief transforming into anger that burned with white-hot intensity. "This is systematic neglect of veterans who served their country and deserve better care." Dr. Chen nodded grimly. "I've contacted the State Medical Board and the Veterans Affairs Office of Inspector General. There's going to be a full investigation into Dr. Thornton's practices and the institutional failures that allowed this pattern to continue unchecked." As Christmas Eve approached, Grace sat beside her father's bed, holding his hand while the machines breathed for him and monitored his failing vital signs. The man who'd been her rock, her guide, and her hero lay unconscious and broken, a victim of the same system he'd served with honor and distinction. Tyler joined her in the early evening, having spent the day at home gathering photo albums and mementos that chronicled Buck's life. Together they created a visual timeline of the man who'd meant everything to both of them: young soldier, devoted husband, loving father, and proud grandfather. Mom, I've been thinking about what Grandpa always told me, Tyler said, his voice steady despite the tears streaming down his face. He said that real heroes don't wear capes. They just do what needs to be done when it needs to be done. Maybe this is his final act of heroism, showing us how broken the system is so we can fix it for other veterans. Grace looked at her son with pride and heartbreak, seeing Buck's strength and wisdom reflected in Tyler's young face. Even in their darkest hour, her father's legacy was living on in the next generation, inspiring them to fight for justice and change that might prevent other families from suffering the same tragedy. As the machines continued their mechanical rhythm and snow fell silently outside the hospital windows, Grace made a promise to her unconscious father. She would make sure his story was heard, his suffering was acknowledged, and his sacrifice would lead to meaningful change in how veterans were treated by the medical system they'd served to protect. The truth began to unravel on Christmas Eve morning when Grace found Dr. Rodriguez sitting in the hospital chapel, his head bowed in prayer before a simple wooden cross. The sight of the composed surgeon in such vulnerable reflection made her pause, recognizing a man wrestling with his own demons while fighting to save her father's life. When he noticed her presence, the expression on his face carried a weight that seemed to go beyond professional concern. "Mrs. Mitchell, there's something I need to tell you about your father's case, something that goes back to Firebase Alpha." Dr. Rodriguez's voice carried the tremor of a man about to confess a burden he'd carried for half a century. The shrapnel in his brain. It wasn't from enemy fire. Grace felt the world tilt beneath her feet as the implications of his words began to sink in. "What are you saying, Doctor?" March 15, 1971. The attack on Firebase Alpha was chaos beyond anything you can imagine. Communication lines were down, visibility was near zero due to smoke and fog, and we had friendlies and enemy forces mixed together in close combat. Dr. Rodriguez's hands trembled slightly as he spoke. "Your father was leading a rescue operation to evacuate wounded soldiers from an exposed position when he took shrapnel to the head." Grace waited, sensing there was more to this revelation that would change everything she thought she knew about her father's service. The fragment that's been in his brain for 50 years came from an American grenade, not Vietnamese ordnance. In the confusion of battle, one of our own soldiers threw a grenade that detonated too close to your father's position. Dr. Rodriguez's voice broke slightly. "It was friendly fire, Mrs. Mitchell." Buck Harrison spent 50 years carrying a piece of American shrapnel because of a mistake made by his own side. The revelation hit Grace like a physical blow, reframing everything about her father's military service and the invisible wounds he'd carried home from Vietnam. Buck hadn't just survived enemy attacks. He'd been wounded by his own forces, and then spent decades living with the physical consequences while never knowing the truth about what had happened to him. "Does he know?" Grace asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't believe so. The battlefield conditions were so chaotic that many details were never properly documented. Your father was evacuated unconscious, and by the time he regained awareness, the official reports had been filed listing his injury as enemy action." Dr. Rodriguez paused, clearly struggling with the weight of this knowledge. "I was the medic who treated him initially, and I've carried this secret for 50 years. But that wasn't the end of the shocking revelations." As Dr. Rodriguez continued his confession, Grace learned that her father's heroism that day had been even more extraordinary than anyone knew. Buck had been wounded while single-handedly holding a defensive position that allowed dozens of soldiers to evacuate safely, including the young medic who would later become Dr. Rodriguez. "Your father saved my life that day, along with 5 other wounded soldiers. He stayed in that exposed position, providing covering fire while wounded and disoriented until every last man was evacuated to safety." Dr. Rodriguez's eyes filled with tears. "I recommended him for the Medal of Honor, but the paperwork was lost in the chaos of the base evacuation. He never received the recognition he deserved. Grace felt a mixture of pride and rage building in her chest, pride in her father's extraordinary courage, and rage at the systematic failures that had denied him proper recognition and medical care for half a century. "Dr. Rodriguez, why are you telling me this now?" "Because Dr. Thornton knew," came the devastating reply. "I discovered yesterday that Thornton had access to classified military medical records through his connections in the Veterans Affairs system. He knew about the shrapnel, he knew about the friendly fire incident, and he knew that acknowledging your father's condition would open up liability issues for the military and the VA. The pieces of a conspiracy began falling into place in Grace's mind. Dr. Thornton's dismissive treatment wasn't just negligence, it was an active cover-up designed to protect institutional interests at the expense of Buck's health and life. The small-town doctor had been acting as a gatekeeper, preventing veterans like her father from receiving the care they needed and deserved. "There's more," Dr. Rodriguez continued, his voice heavy with the weight of additional revelations. "I've been investigating Dr. Thornton's background since your father's surgery. He wasn't just an Army medic. He was a medical officer who was court-martialed in 1973 for falsifying medical records to cover up friendly fire incidents that resulted in casualties." Grace felt sick as the full scope of the betrayal became clear. The man they'd trusted with Buck's care was someone who'd built his civilian career on a foundation of covering up military medical mistakes. Thornton had seen Buck's case not as a patient needing help, but as a potential threat to his own carefully constructed life. The most shocking revelation came when Dr. Rodriguez showed Grace a file he'd obtained through his own military connections. Buck's missing Medal of Honor recommendation had been deliberately suppressed, not lost. The incident at Firebase Alpha had involved friendly fire that killed 3 American soldiers, and the military had covered up the circumstances to avoid negative publicity during an already unpopular war. Your father's heroism threatened to expose the cover-up because his actions directly contradicted the official version of events that blamed the casualties on enemy action, Dr. Rodriguez explained. Instead of being honored as a hero, he became a liability that needed to be managed and silenced. Grace thought about all the times her father had downplayed his military service, how he'd never talked about specific battles or claimed any special recognition for his actions. She'd always attributed his modesty to the typical stoicism of his generation, but now she realized it might have been something darker. The psychological impact of being wounded by his own side and then systematically denied acknowledgement or proper care. The final piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected source. Tyler had been conducting his own research into his grandfather's military service, using social media to connect with other veterans and family members. Through a Vietnam Veterans Facebook group, he discovered that 3 other soldiers from Buck's unit were still alive and living in various parts of the country. "Mom, I've been talking to these guys online and they all remember Grandpa," Tyler said excitedly when he arrived at the hospital that evening. "They call him a hero, and they've been wondering for 50 years why he never got the recognition he deserved." One of these veterans, now living in Arizona, had maintained detailed personal records of the Firebase Alpha battle because he'd never believed the official version of events. When Tyler contacted him, the man immediately offered to provide witness testimony about Buck's actions and the cover-up that had followed. "Mrs. Mitchell," the veteran told Grace during a phone call that evening, "your father single-handedly saved dozens of lives that day, including my own. We've been waiting 50 years for someone to tell the truth about what really happened at Firebase Alpha." As Christmas Eve night fell over the Denver VA Medical Center, Grace sat beside her father's still form with a new understanding of the man who'd raised her. Buck Harrison wasn't just a veteran who'd served his country. He was a genuine war hero who'd been systematically betrayed by the institutions he'd sacrificed to protect. The monitors showed slight improvement in Buck's brain activity, and Dr. Rodriguez cautiously suggested that the latest surgery might have been successful in relieving the pressure that had been threatening his life. But even as hope began to emerge for Buck's physical recovery, Grace realized that the fight for justice was just beginning. She looked at Tyler, who was reading aloud from one of Buck's favorite books, and made a silent promise. They would expose the truth about Firebase Alpha. They would hold Dr. Thornton accountable for his negligence and cover-up, and they would make sure that Buck Harrison finally received the recognition and honor he'd earned 50 years ago. The truth had taken half a century to emerge, but Grace was determined that it would not remain buried any longer. Her father had carried the weight of that Vietnam battlefield in his brain for 50 years, and now it was time for the world to know the price he'd paid for his heroism. Outside the hospital windows, snow continued to fall on Christmas Eve, but inside the ICU, a family prepared to fight for justice that had been denied for far too long. Christmas morning arrived with the kind of pristine silence that only fresh snow can bring, transforming the view from Buck's hospital window into a winter wonderland that seemed to promise new beginnings. Grace had maintained her vigil through the night, and as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the frosted glass, she noticed something that made her heart skip a beat. Her father's eyes were open, clear and focused for the first time since his surgery. "Gracie," Buck's voice was hoarse from the breathing tube that had been removed the previous evening, but it carried the familiar warmth that had been absent for so long. "Is that you, sweetheart?" Grace felt tears of relief streaming down her face as she gripped her father's hand, feeling his fingers squeeze back with surprising strength. "Dad? Yes, it's me. You're in the hospital, but you're going to be okay. You had surgery to remove something from your brain, something that's been there since Vietnam." Buck's expression showed confusion as he tried to process this information, but his eyes remained clear and alert. "Vietnam? I remember. Explosions, smoke, trying to get the boys to safety." His voice grew stronger as memories began returning. "There was a young medic, scared kid who kept everyone calm under fire. Whatever happened to him?" Dr. Rodriguez chose that moment to enter the room for his morning rounds, and the recognition that passed between the two men was immediate and profound. 50 years melted away as the elderly veteran and the accomplished surgeon saw each other clearly for the first time since that chaotic day at Firebase Alpha. "Sergeant Harrison," Dr. Rodriguez said, his voice thick with emotion, "I'm that scared kid you saved." "My name is Sam Rodriguez, and I've spent my entire medical career hoping for the chance to repay the debt I owe you." Buck's face lit up with the kind of joy that transcends physical pain and medical complications. "Well, I'll be damned. Little Sammy Rodriguez, you weren't much bigger than a minute, but you had hands steadier than a surgeon when the shells were falling." He paused, studying the distinguished man before him. "Looks like you made good on that promise to become a real doctor." Tyler arrived moments later with an armload of Christmas presents and stopped short at the sight of his grandfather sitting up in bed, engaged in animated conversation with Dr. Rodriguez. The teenager's face transformed with pure happiness as he realized that the man he'd feared losing was not only alive, but clearly himself again. "Grandpa Buck, you're awake. You're really awake." Tyler rushed to the bedside, careful not to disturb the medical equipment, but unable to contain his excitement. I brought your Purple Heart and some pictures I thought you might want to see." As Buck examined the photographs Tyler had collected, images spanning from his Vietnam service through decades of family life, Dr. Rodriguez shared the truth about the friendly fire incident and the cover-up that had denied Buck proper recognition for his heroism. Rather than anger, Buck's response showed the wisdom and grace that had defined his character throughout his life. "You know, I always wondered why I felt different after that day, like part of me never came home from that fire base," Buck said thoughtfully. "Turns out, part of me really didn't. It was stuck in my head all these years." He looked at his daughter and grandson with profound gratitude. "But look at what I got instead. I got 50 extra years to love your grandmother, to raise Gracie, to know Tyler. That shrapnel might have been a burden, but it also gave me a lifetime I might not have had otherwise." The investigation into Dr. Thornton's negligence moved swiftly once Buck's story became public. The State Medical Board launched a formal inquiry, and the Veterans Affairs Inspector General opened a comprehensive review of veteran care in rural Colorado. Tyler's social media campaign had attracted national attention, with news outlets picking up the story of the war hero who'd been denied proper medical care for decades. More importantly, Buck's case had inspired other veteran families to come forward with their own stories of dismissed symptoms and inadequate care. A class action lawsuit was filed against Dr. Thornton and the medical practice that had enabled his negligence, while congressional representatives began calling for hearings on veteran health care in underserved communities. 6 months later, on a perfect spring morning in Pinewood Springs, Buck stood in the town square wearing his dress uniform, finally receiving the recognition he'd earned 50 years earlier. The ceremony was attended by hundreds of community members, fellow veterans, and family members who'd traveled from across the country to honor the man who'd saved so many lives at Firebase Alpha. Grace watched from the front row as Colorado's governor presented her father with the state's highest honor for military service, while Tyler stood proudly beside his grandfather in his ROTC dress uniform, having been inspired to follow in Buck's footsteps of service to country. Dr. Rodriguez was present as the guest of honor, having been instrumental in bringing Buck's heroism to light and ensuring that the truth finally emerged. The memorial garden dedicated in Buck's honor featured a simple stone bench where visitors could sit and reflect on the cost of freedom. The inscription read, "In honor of Robert Buck Harrison and all veterans who carry invisible wounds in service to their country, their sacrifice is not forgotten." As the ceremony concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Buck found himself sitting on that bench with Grace and Tyler, 3 generations bound together by love, resilience, and the understanding that sometimes the greatest battles are fought long after the war has ended. "You know," Buck said, watching children play on the grass where the ceremony had taken place, "I spent 50 years thinking I was carrying a burden from Vietnam. Turns out I was carrying a gift, the chance to show that healing is possible, that truth matters, and that family love can overcome anything." Grace squeezed her father's hand, grateful beyond words for the Christmas miracle that had brought him back to them and given their family the chance to help ensure that no other veteran would suffer in silence as Buck had for so many years. When Buck Harrison collapsed on Christmas Eve with a mysterious lump behind his ear, his family had no idea they were about to uncover a 50-year-old secret that would change everything. This decorated Vietnam veteran had been carrying enemy shrapnel in his brain since 1971, but local doctors dismissed his symptoms as normal aging for months while he suffered in agony. What Grace discovered about her father's true heroism, saving dozens of lives at Firebase Alpha while wounded by friendly fire, and the systematic cover-up that denied him proper care for decades, reveals a heartbreaking truth about how our veterans are sometimes failed by the very system they served to protect. Buck's story isn't just about medical negligence. It's about the invisible wounds our greatest generation carries, the strength of family bonds that refuse to break, and the healing power of truth finally spoken. When Dr. Rodriguez, The young medic Buck had saved 50 years earlier operated on him. It completed a circle of honor and gratitude that proves heroes never really stop serving. Buck's Christmas miracle reminds us that it's never too late for justice, recognition, or the deep happiness that comes from seeing our loved ones finally receive the honor they've always deserved. Have you or a loved one ever faced dismissive medical care? What would you want people to know about the hidden struggles of our veteran community? Please share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below.